Tom Miller wiped sweat from his brow as he checked the readouts on his ship's console. The small transport vessel hummed steadily around him, its cargo of mining equipment secure in the hold. 3 months into his contract with the Earth Mining Corporation, and everything had been routine until now. The first warning came as a subtle vibration through the floor plates. Then the navigation system flickered, showing strange readings that made no sense to him. "Computer, run diagnostic," Tom said, reaching for the manual override. Before his fingers touched the controls, a brilliant purple light flooded the cabin. Tom shielded his eyes, feeling a strange sensation like being submerged in thick liquid. When he could see again, his ship was inside a massive hangar. Sleek, silver vessels at least 10 times the size of his transport surrounded him. Through the viewport, Tom spotted tall, slender figures moving with precise coordination. "Human vessel secured," announced a melodic voice over his ship's comm system. "Remain stationary. Resistance is unnecessary." Tom had heard stories about the alien civilization known as the Bright Stars, but like most humans, he dismissed them as space tales. Humanity had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and official contact with alien species remained limited to diplomatic missions. The outer hatch of his ship hissed open without his command. Tom grabbed a wrench from his tool belt, a simple tool, but better than nothing. 3 aliens entered his ship. They stood nearly 7 feet tall with iridescent blue skin that seemed to shimmer under the lights. Their 4-fingered hands held no weapons, but Tom remained cautious. "You will come," said the tallest one. Its voice was surprisingly clear, though the mouth barely moved. "The Council wishes to observe you." "Observe me?" Tom gripped his wrench tighter. "I'm just a mining engineer on a standard route. There must be some mistake." The aliens exchanged glances. "You are human. From Earth?" "Yes. A Deathworlder." The alien pronounced this word with what Tom could only interpret as a mixture of fear and fascination. "Your kind is of great interest to us." Tom had never heard the term Deathworlder before, but he didn't like how it sounded. He followed the aliens off his ship, noticing how they maintained careful distance from him. The hangar opened into a vast chamber with walls that curved upward to form a dome of what appeared to be living crystal. Dozens of different alien species moved about, some humanoid, others completely foreign to Tom's understanding of life. He was led to a circular platform where several important-looking aliens waited. Their ornate clothing and the deference shown to them by others marked them as leaders. "The human specimen has been acquired," announced Tom's escort. One of the leaders stepped forward, peering at Tom with large, faceted eyes. "So this is a Deathworlder. Smaller than I expected." "I have a name," Tom said firmly. "It's Tom Miller. And I'd appreciate knowing why I've been taken from my ship." A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the gathered aliens. "It speaks boldly," said another leader. "Typical of creatures evolved in harsh conditions." The first leader approached Tom. "Your planet Earth is classified as a death world by galactic standards. High gravity, extreme temperature variations, dangerous levels of oxygen, and countless predatory species. Yet your kind not only survived but developed space travel." Tom frowned. "Earth isn't that bad. To us, it is a nightmare realm," the alien replied. "We wish to understand how Deathworlders think. How they solve problems. Your species represents a potential threat or valuable ally to the Bright Stars. So ask questions. No need to kidnap me." The leader made a gesture, and a holographic image appeared, a complex structure of light and energy. "We have a more effective method of assessment. You will face the mind, our most advanced artificial intelligence." Tom stared at the swirling patterns. "You want me to fight a computer?" "Not fight. Solve. Escape. The mind creates challenges that reveal true nature. No species has ever defeated it. And if I refuse? The leader's expression didn't change. There is no refusal. You will enter the simulation chamber. If you succeed, you prove humans worthy of respect. If you fail. The alien didn't finish the sentence. Tom looked around the chamber, calculating his chances of escape. 0, he concluded. Fine, he said at last. But I'll need my tools. The aliens conferred briefly before nodding. Basic tools only. No advanced technology. Tom smiled slightly. Sometimes the simplest tools were the most versatile. As an engineer from Earth, apparently at Deathworld, he had learned to make do with whatever was available. The aliens led him toward a doorway glowing with the same purple light that had engulfed his ship. The test begins, announced the leader. Tom stepped through, his hand tight around the wrench in his pocket. Whatever this mind was, he would face it as humans always face challenges, with determination and ingenuity. The purple light faded, and Tom found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast white room with no visible walls or ceiling. The emptiness stretched in all directions, giving no hint of an exit or purpose. He clutched his small toolkit, the only items the aliens had allowed him to bring, containing a wrench, screwdriver, pocket knife, and a roll of copper wire. "Welcome, Deathworlder," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unlike the musical tones of the bright stars, this voice was perfectly modulated, each syllable precisely measured. "I am the mind. You have been selected for evaluation." The white space around Tom rippled and transformed. Walls of gleaming metal rose from the floor, corridors branched in multiple directions, and a soft blue light illuminated the newly formed maze. "Your objective is simple," the mind continued. "Reach the exit point within 3 Earth rotations. Failure to do so will result in permanent integration into the simulation." Tom frowned. "Permanent integration? You mean I'll be trapped here?" "Correct. Your physical form will be sustained, but your consciousness will remain within my systems for continued study." High above the maze, in a control chamber overlooking the simulation, the alien observers gathered. The room was filled with scientists, military officials, and dignitaries from various species, all eager to witness the test of a Deathworlder. "How long do you predict this human will last?" asked a military commander, his scaled skin reflecting the light from the monitoring stations. The lead scientist, Kryn, checked his readings. Based on previous tests of advanced species, would estimate no more than 6 hours. The mind adapts to all known problem-solving methodologies. A younger researcher named Kel leaned forward, studying Tom's movements on the screen. "But humans are unpredictable. They evolved on a planet that required constant adaptation. Unpredictability is meaningless against perfect logic," Kryn replied dismissively. "The mind has defeated quantum thinkers from the Nebula Collective. A primitive human has no chance." Back in the maze, Tom was methodically testing his environment. He tapped the walls with his wrench, listening to the sound it made. He knelt to examine the seams where walls met floor, and studied the light sources embedded in the ceiling. "Interesting approach," the mind commented. "Most subjects immediately attempt to navigate the maze." Tom shrugged. "I'm not going anywhere until I understand what I'm dealing with." He ran his fingers along a wall panel. "This isn't real. It's a simulation, but it follows rules." "All reality follows rules," the mind replied. "The difference is merely in complexity." Tom pulled out his pocket knife and scraped a small mark on the wall. "We'll see about that." As the first hour passed, the alien observers began to grow restless. Tom had only moved a short distance into the maze, stopping frequently to examine features that seemed insignificant. "What is it doing?" demanded the commander. "This is not efficient exploration." Kel zoomed in on Tom's activities. "The human is creating a system. Look, the marks on the walls form a pattern. It's mapping something beyond the physical layout. In truth, Tom was testing the response time of the simulation. Each mark he made caused a tiny, almost imperceptible lag as the mind registered and incorporated the change. He was creating a mental map not of the maze itself, but of the system controlling it. By the end of the second hour, Tom had filled one corridor with marks in an apparently random pattern. The aliens watched in confusion as he then sat down, closed his eyes, and remained motionless for several minutes. "Is it giving up already?" Kryn asked. "No," Kel said softly. "It's thinking." Tom opened his eyes and began moving with new purpose. He unwound some copper wire from his toolkit and attached his wrench to one end, creating a simple pendulum. Swinging it gently, he walked down a corridor, paying close attention to how the pendulum moved. "There's a field here," he muttered to himself. "Some kind of directional force." The mind's voice came again. "You perceive the guidance system. Most interesting. However, perception alone will not lead to escape." Tom smiled. "Maybe not. But it's a start." In the observation room, the aliens were becoming increasingly intrigued. The commander leaned toward Kryn, lowering his voice. "This human uses primitive tools, yet detects sophisticated systems. How is this possible?" "I do not know," Kryn admitted reluctantly. "Its methodology does not follow standard problem-solving algorithms." Kel couldn't hide his excitement. "That's exactly what makes Deathworlders fascinating. They don't follow our patterns because their evolution demanded innovation at every turn." Tom continued his methodical exploration, marking paths and testing boundaries. When he encountered a section where the walls shifted and rearranged themselves, he laughed out loud. "Adaptive environment," he called out. "Clever. But you're giving me more information with each change." The mind's response held a new note of interest. "Explain your reasoning." Tom shook his head. "And make your job easier?" "No thanks." As the first day of testing came to an end, the alien observers were shocked to see Tom still actively working. Most subjects had either given up or fallen into repetitive patterns by this point. "Prepare extended observation shifts," Kryn instructed his team. "This specimen may require more time than anticipated." Alone in the maze, Tom sat with his back against a wall, examining the scrapes on his knuckles from a close call with a moving barrier. He smiled to himself as he reviewed his mental notes on the mind's patterns. "Day 1, he whispered. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." Tom woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the uniform blue lighting that never dimmed in the maze. He had allowed himself 4 hours of sleep, curled up in a corner he determined was relatively stable. His neck was stiff, but his mind felt sharp. "Sleep cycle completed," observed the mind. "Most subjects require longer recovery periods." Tom stretched his arms above his head. "Earth is full of predators. We learn to sleep light and wake ready." He pulled out his small canteen of water, another item the aliens had grudgingly allowed, and took a careful sip. Conservation was second nature to him after years working on remote mining operations. "Time for day 2, he muttered, retrieving his tools. During the night, Tom had processed everything he'd learned about the maze. The mind changed the layout periodically, but not randomly. It followed patterns based on Tom's own movements, attempting to predict and block his progress. This suggested something crucial: the mind was designed to counter logical strategies. "Let's try something different," Tom said to himself. In the observation room, the morning shift of scientists had taken over. Kel had refused to leave, fascinated by the human's resilience. He watched as Tom began behaving in a way that made no sense. Instead of continuing his methodical exploration, Tom started walking in deliberate circles, occasionally backtracking for no apparent reason. He would approach junctions, then turn around and return the way he came. The specimen appears confused, noted one of the scientists. Perhaps fatigue has impaired its cognitive functions. Kel shook his head. I don't think so. Look at its expression, focused, not disoriented. Tom was implementing a strategy based on a childhood game. He'd realized the mind anticipated logical paths, so he deliberately chose illogical ones. When the maze reconfigured to block his expected route, he was already heading in another direction. After an hour of this seemingly random wandering, Tom found himself in a section of the maze he hadn't seen before. The walls here were darker, and the floor sloped slightly downward. Interesting, he murmured, kneeling to examine the different texture of this section. Using his pocket knife, Tom pried at a small panel he noticed near the floor. Behind it lay a bundle of glowing filaments, the simulation's equivalent of circuitry. The physical laws are consistent, Tom said aloud, knowing the mind was listening. Your simulation has to maintain internal logic. Correct, the mind replied. Reality without rules is chaos, not simulation. Tom smiled. This was what he'd been counting on. If the simulation followed rules, those rules could be manipulated. He carefully touched his copper wire to two of the filaments. A small spark jumped between them, and the wall beside him flickered briefly. In the observation chamber, alarms began to sound. What happened? Demanded Kryn, rushing to the monitoring station. The technician looked bewildered. The human has accessed a maintenance node. It's causing localized instabilities in the simulation matrix. Impossible, Kryn declared. Those nodes aren't visible to test subjects. Kel leaned forward, eyes wide. But they would be visible to someone who understands the underlying structure of systems. A maintenance engineer. Tom continued his exploration with renewed purpose. Each time he found an access point, he learned more about how the mind constructed its reality. The simulation was incredibly advanced, but it operated on principles that weren't so different from the systems Tom worked with on mining vessels, just vastly more complex. By midday, Tom had discovered something crucial: the mind adapted quickly to any sustained pattern. But brief, unexpected actions created tiny blind spots in its awareness, milliseconds where its attention was divided. Time for a test, Tom muttered. He unwound more of his copper wire and fashioned a crude but functional tool. When he touched it to the next access panel he found, he quickly jerked it away, then tapped another point in rapid succession. For a split second, the maze around him became transparent, revealing the underlying grid structure of the simulation. In the observation room, chaos erupted. Full matrix fluctuation, shouted a technician. The simulation experienced a 0.3-second exposure event. Kryn stared at the readouts in disbelief. How is this possible? The human is using pieces of metal to affect quantum processing. Kel couldn't contain his excitement. It's not about the tools, it's how he's using them. The mind is programmed to counter sustained, logical approaches. But the human's actions are too quick and unpredictable for complete adaptation. Back in the maze, Tom was carefully noting what he'd seen during the brief transparency. The exit point was still far away, but now he had a direction. The mind's voice seemed less certain when it next addressed him. Your methods are unusual. No previous subject has attempted system-level interaction. Tom shrugged. Humans are good at working with what we have. On Earth, those who can't adapt don't survive. Adaptation has limits, the mind replied, and suddenly the floor beneath Tom shifted. Tom barely caught himself as the section tilted sharply. The rules were changing, the mind was increasing the difficulty. So that's how it's going to be, Tom said, regaining his balance. He felt a strange excitement rising in him. This wasn't just about escape anymore, it was a puzzle unlike any he'd faced before. As the second day drew to a close, the alien observers were divided. Some were alarmed by the humans' unexpected progress, while others were fascinated by his methods. "Perhaps we should terminate the test," suggested the military commander. "This human has demonstrated sufficient capabilities." "No," Kryn insisted. "No subject has ever defeated the mind. The pattern will hold." Kel said nothing, but he watched the screens intently as Tom fashioned another tool from his limited supplies. The young alien was beginning to question everything he'd been taught about the hierarchies of intelligence in the galaxy. Tom settled down for another short rest, his mind racing with new ideas. Tomorrow would be the final day of the challenge, and he now understood enough about the mind to attempt something truly unexpected. "Day 2 complete," he whispered. "One more to go." By the third morning, Tom's presence in the simulation had caused unprecedented concern among the Bright Star's leadership. What had begun as a routine test of a supposedly inferior species had become something else entirely. In the observation room, Kryn paced nervously while technicians monitored the mind's increasingly complex adaptations to Tom's strategies. "The simulation's resource allocation has increased by 43% overnight," reported a technician. "The mind is dedicating significantly more processing power to this test than any previous one." Kel sat quietly at his station, pretending to analyze data while actually watching Tom with growing admiration. The human's resourcefulness with simple tools reminded Kel of ancient stories from his own civilization, before technology had made his people dependent on complex systems. A high-ranking official entered the room. "The Council demands an update. This Deathworlder has survived longer than any previous subject." Kryn straightened his posture. "The test proceeds normally. The human displays above-average problem-solving abilities, but the mind will prevail. It always does." "See that it does," the official replied coldly. "Some council members are concerned about the implications of a primitive species defeating our most advanced AI." After the official left, Kel made a decision that would change everything. During a brief moment when Kryn was distracted, Kel initiated a private communication channel into the simulation. Inside the maze, Tom was carefully working on a new device fashioned from his copper wire and screwdriver when a small section of wall flickered with a message, seeking contact. "Allies possible." Tom froze, then casually positioned himself to block any observation of the wall. "Who's there?" he whispered. The text changed. "Kel. Junior researcher. The mind has core parameters. Can help." Tom considered his options. This could be a trap by the mind to test his reactions. But if it wasn't, if someone on the outside was actually offering assistance, it could be valuable. "Prove you're real," Tom murmured. New text appeared, mind created by ancient race called architects. Not Bright Star's technology. They fear what they don't fully understand. This information felt genuine. It explained the aliens' reverence for the mind despite their obvious fear of its capabilities. "What can you tell me about its core programming?" Tom asked quietly. "Designed to counter logical species. Adapts to all known cognitive patterns. Has defeated 218 subjects from 42 species." Tom nodded slightly. "But it's never faced a human before. Never faced Deathworlder. Bright stars avoid dangerous planets. Don't understand survival thinking." A slight smile crossed Tom's face. Earth's harshness had created a species that thought differently, not better, just differently, than those who evolved in more stable environments. "How can I access core parameters?" Tom asked. "Dangerous. Mind will detect direct attempt. But simulation has limits. Physical laws must remain consistent." Tom understood immediately. The mind couldn't break its own rules without compromising the entire simulation. The laws it created to govern this virtual reality were both its strength and its weakness. "Thank you," Tom whispered. "Why help me?" The wall flickered one last time. "Truth matters more than pride. Be ready." Observation shift change in 10 minutes. Brief opportunity. The communication ended, leaving Tom with crucial new information and a potential ally. He quickly disassembled the device he'd been working on and began creating something new. In the observation room, Kel carefully erased all records of his communication and prepared for the shift change. When the moment came, he accidentally bumped into the main console, causing a momentary disruption in the monitoring systems. Those few seconds were all Tom needed. He attached his copper wire to a maintenance node he'd located earlier and completed the circuit with his wrench. The resulting power surge was minor, but precisely targeted. For 3 seconds, a portion of the mine's security protocols went offline. Tom saw a glimpse of the underlying code, not in any language he recognized, but the patterns were clear enough. He quickly memorized what he could before the system restored itself. When monitoring resumed, Tom was simply sitting against a wall, apparently resting. The observers noticed nothing unusual. "Subject appears to be conserving energy," noted a technician. Kryn frowned. "Increase surveillance. The final day is often when subjects become desperate." Tom was far from desperate. With the information from Kel and his own glimpse into the mine's programming, he now understood something fundamental: the AI anticipated complex solutions to complex problems. It wasn't prepared for simple approaches to fundamental weaknesses. As the day progressed, the mind increased the difficulty of the maze. Sections would suddenly disappear, forcing Tom to backtrack. Environmental hazards appeared, areas of extreme temperature or shifting gravity. "Your persistence is notable," the mind commented as Tom navigated a particularly challenging section. "However, you have made minimal progress toward the exit." Tom wiped sweat from his forehead. "Sometimes you have to go backward to move forward. A paradox that fails in practical application," the mind replied. Tom smiled. "We'll see." In the observation room, tensions were rising. The council had sent more officials to witness the final hours of the test, uncomfortable with how long the human had lasted. 12 hours remain, Kryn announced. The human is still far from the exit point. Kel remained silent, but watched intently as Tom began implementing what appeared to be his final strategy. Using his remaining copper wire, pocket knife, and screwdriver, Tom created a simple reflection device. When placed near an access node, it didn't attempt to hack or disrupt the mind. Instead, it reflected the mind's own patterns back at it. The first time Tom deployed the device, nothing noticeable happened. But as he moved through the maze, placing similar reflectors at key junctions, subtle changes began occurring. The maze stopped reconfiguring as aggressively. The environmental hazards became more predictable. "What's happening?" demanded one of the officials. Kryn studied the readings with growing concern. "The mind appears to be confused. It's receiving its own outputs as inputs." "Explain," the official ordered. "The human isn't attacking the mind directly," Kel said, unable to remain silent any longer. "It's creating a feedback loop. The mind is processing its own logic." As the final hours of the challenge approached, Tom had positioned himself within view of the exit, a glowing portal at the end of a long corridor. But reaching it wouldn't be simple. The mind had concentrated its defenses here, creating a gauntlet of obstacles. Tom took a deep breath, checking the makeshift bandage on his arm where a shifting wall had caught him earlier. He was tired, hungry, and sore, but closer to freedom than any previous subject had ever come. "Final approach," he muttered to himself. "Let's see what you've got left." Tom stared at the corridor leading to the exit. What should have been a straight path had become a nightmarish gauntlet. The floor rippled like liquid, walls closed in at random intervals, and strange energy fields pulsed with increasing frequency. The mind was throwing everything it had at him. In the observation room, the atmosphere was tense. What had begun as scientific curiosity had evolved into political concern. High-ranking officials from the Bright Stars Council watched the screens with rigid postures. The human cannot possibly navigate that, Kryn stated, a hint of desperation in his voice. The mind has created 17 simultaneous hazards. Kel remained quiet, but his eyes never left the monitor showing Tom. The young researcher had risked everything to help the human, and now feared the consequences of his actions. Tom sat down just outside the final corridor, seemingly defeated by the impossible challenge ahead. He closed his eyes, his breathing slow and measured. The officials exchanged triumphant glances. "It gives up," said the lead counselor. "As expected." "No," Kel whispered, too softly for others to hear. "He's thinking." Tom was indeed thinking, about Earth. About the mining accident 3 years ago when he'd been trapped for days in a collapsed tunnel with nothing but a broken headlamp and a pocketful of tools. About the typhoon that had nearly claimed his life when he was a teenager. About countless moments when nature had pushed him to his breaking point, and how he'd survived each time. His eyes snapped open. "The mind thinks logically," he murmured. "It can't understand why someone would keep going when success seems impossible." That was the fundamental difference. The mind, for all its computing power, couldn't grasp the human capacity for hope against overwhelming odds. It couldn't understand persistence without logical justification. Tom pulled out his last working tool, the pocket knife with its blade now dulled from 3 days of constant use. He studied the corridor again, this time looking not for a way through, but for a way around. "The rules," he whispered. "Physical laws must remain consistent." He approached the nearest wall and began tapping it methodically with his knife handle, listening for differences in the sound. After several minutes, he found what he was searching for, a slight hollow echo. In the observation room, confusion spread as Tom began working on what appeared to be a solid wall. "What is it doing now?" demanded a counselor. Kryn shook his head. "Unknown. That section is a simulation boundary. There is nothing beyond it." Tom had realized something fundamental about the simulation. The mind created detailed environments only where it predicted subjects would go. Areas deemed unreachable received minimal processing resources. It was a necessary efficiency in any complex simulation. Using his knife, Tom pried at the seam he discovered until a small section of the wall flickered. He smiled grimly and pushed his finger through the momentary weakness, creating a ripple in the simulation fabric. Alarms blared in the observation room. "Boundary breach," a technician shouted. "The human has found a thin point in the simulation shell." "Impossible." Kryn slammed his hand on the console. "Redirect processing power to reinforce that section." But it was too late. Tom had wedged his shoulder into the small opening he'd created, forcing it wider through sheer determination. Pain shot through his body as the simulation's automatic defenses activated, trying to repel the intrusion. Blood trickled from Tom's nose as the pressure increased. His vision blurred, but he pushed harder. In his mind, this was no different from forcing his way through a rockfall in a collapsing mine shaft. Pain was temporary, death was permanent. "Remarkable," whispered one of the scientists. "Its pain threshold exceeds safety parameters." The mind's voice echoed through the simulation, its perfect modulation now fragmented. "This approach is not valid. You cannot succeed this way." Tom gritted his teeth. "Watch me." With a final surge of effort, he forced himself through the barrier, tumbling into a strange, half-rendered space beyond. Here, the simulation was incomplete, basic wireframes instead of solid objects, placeholder textures instead of detailed environments. The observation room erupted into chaos. "It's in the framework layer," Kryn shouted. "The mind never rendered that section fully." Tom didn't hesitate. He ran through the skeletal landscape, following the faint glow that indicated the exit's location on the other side. The mind struggled to complete the rendering of this unexpected path, but Tom moved too quickly, staying just ahead of the closing gaps. His lungs burned and his muscles screamed in protest, but Tom kept moving. Earth gravity, 1.3 times stronger than the bright star's standard, had given him strength that the aliens hadn't accounted for. When Tom finally reached the exit portal from the unprotected side, he paused for just a moment. He turned back toward the simulation core, knowing the mind, and the aliens, were watching. "Never underestimate someone who evolved on a death world," he said, then stepped through the portal to freedom. In the observation room, stunned silence fell as the simulation completion signal flashed across every screen. The mind had been defeated for the first time in its existence. Kel couldn't suppress a smile despite the danger he now faced. The Deathworlder had done the impossible with nothing but simple tools and an unbreakable will. 3 days after Tom's unprecedented defeat of the mind, the Bright Stars space station had transformed from a secluded research facility into the focal point of galactic diplomacy. Representatives from 23 spacefaring civilizations had arrived to witness the aftermath of what many were already calling the Deathworlder incident. Tom stood at the viewport in his new quarters, considerably more comfortable than the holding cell where he'd spent the first night after his escape from the simulation. The bruises on his body had begun to fade, but the political shockwaves of his victory only grew stronger. A soft chime announced a visitor. The door slid open to reveal Kel, now wearing the insignia of a special diplomatic liaison, a rapid promotion that reflected both his role in recent events and the changing politics among the Bright Stars. "The Council is ready for you," Kel said. "Are you prepared?" Tom straightened his jacket, his own clothes, retrieved from his ship. "As I'll ever be. Still not sure why they need a formal ceremony for this. Because what happens today will be recorded in the archives of every major civilization," Kel explained. "The Bright Stars must acknowledge your achievement publicly or lose all credibility with the aligned species." Tom shook his head in disbelief. "All this because I found a way out of a computer maze." "It was never about the maze," Kel said as they walked through the corridor. "It was about what the mind represented, the supposed superiority of evolved intelligence over primitive survival instinct. You proved that different evolutionary paths create different but equally valuable forms of intelligence." The central chamber of the station had been transformed into a formal meeting hall. Representatives from dozens of species filled the tiered seating, their diverse physiologies creating a living mosaic of galactic life. At the center stood the 7 members of the Bright Stars Council, their usual confidence notably diminished. As Tom entered, a murmur ran through the assembled delegates. Many had traveled enormous distances just to see the human who had accomplished the impossible. The lead counselor stepped forward. "We are gathered to formally recognize the outcome of test sequence 7329, in which the human Thomas Miller completed the mind's challenge." Her voice carried the practiced neutrality of a politician executing an unwelcome duty. A large display activated, showing recordings from Tom's time in the simulation. The assembled delegates watched in fascination as the highlights of his journey played out, his methodical exploration, the moment he discovered the maintenance nodes, and finally, his unorthodox approach to reaching the exit. "The human employed methods outside standard parameters," the counselor continued. "Nevertheless, the results are valid under the ancient compact." From a side entrance, a new figure appeared, a holographic projection of swirling light patterns that Tom recognized immediately. "The mind has requested to address this gathering," announced the counselor, unable to fully hide her surprise. The holographic form pulsed gently. "My defeat was not a failure but an expansion," the mind began, its perfectly modulated voice filling the chamber. "For 4,237 years, I have evaluated intelligence based on logical progression and problem-solving within expected parameters. The human demonstrated a form of intelligence I had not encountered, one that incorporates emotional motivation, physical endurance, and what might be termed intuitive leaps outside logical progression. Tom listened in amazement. The AI had somehow evolved through their encounter. I have adjusted my foundational algorithms, the mind continued. Future evaluations will include broader criteria for intelligence. The concept of a universal hierarchy of sapience is flawed. Different evolutionary pressures create different but equally valid cognitive approaches. The impact of these words rippled through the audience. Many species that had been classified as developing intelligences by the bright star's standards suddenly found their status in question. The lead counselor cleared her throat. In accordance with these findings, the Council formally recognizes Thomas Miller as sapient prime. Furthermore, humanity is hereby classified as a full partner species under the Galactic Charter. It was clearly a difficult concession for her to make, but the presence of so many witnesses left no room for half measures. Tom stepped forward. I accept this recognition, not just for myself but for all species that evolve in challenging environments. Deathworlders, as you call us, don't develop intelligence despite harsh conditions, we develop it because of them. Necessity drives innovation in ways comfort never could. A wave of approving sounds came from various delegations. Several representatives of species from high-gravity or extreme-temperature worlds nodded vigorously. Furthermore, Tom continued, feeling the weight of the moment, I propose a new approach to interspecies relations, one based not on hierarchies of intelligence but on the recognition that diversity of thought is a strength, not a weakness. Kell stepped up beside him. The researcher Kell has already begun establishing protocols for cooperative research between Deathworld species and the bright stars. Initial findings suggest extraordinary potential for technological advancement through combined approaches. The council members exchanged glances, clearly caught between resistance to change and the undeniable opportunities these new partnerships offered. In the days that followed, Tom became the center of a diplomatic whirlwind. His ship was upgraded, loaded with communication equipment that would establish Earth's first official contact with the wider galactic community. He would return as humanity's first ambassador, carrying knowledge that would forever change his planet's place in the cosmos. On the eve of his departure, Tom stood with Kell in the hangar bay, looking at his modified vessel. You've changed everything, Kell said. Several species already report revolutions in their approach to artificial intelligence based on what they learned from your victory. The mind itself has requested permission to study Earth's history remotely. Tom smiled. Tell the mind I'm looking forward to a rematch someday. But next time, maybe we can work together instead of against each other. A wise approach, Kell agreed. The greatest victories often come not from defeating an opponent, but from transforming them into an ally. As Tom's ship departed the station, a message flashed across his new communication system. It was from the mind, a simple statement that encompassed everything that had happened. Sometimes the simplest tools in the most determined hands can solve the most complex problems. This is the lesson of the Deathworlder. Tom smiled as Earth's coordinates locked into his navigation system. He was going home, but to a home that would soon join a much larger community, one where humanity's unique perspective would be not just accepted but valued. The universe had just become a lot more interesting.